Welcome back, everyone. We're here to speak about, I think, one of the most prolific murderers of our time. The man known as Israel Keyes, or I would like to call him the Demon Carpenter. But I don't think words can simply describe how horrible this one is. Let's try to wrap our heads around this one. Israel Keyes was born in Richmond, Utah, a state that has a high property crime rate, which has receded in recent years. In 2001 to 2007, he lived in Neah Bay, Washington, in which he fathered a girl while working for the Maka tribe, surprisingly a productive part of the tribal community. But while being a good citizen of Neah Bay and a good father to his daughter, he had a secret like no other. Living in Washington, the state that is, it gave him the power to traverse from Anchorage, Alaska, a place commonly known for crime of aggravated assault and, if I'm not mistaken, leading in violent crimes. So this seems like a place Mr. Keyes would naturally gravitate to. Keyes had 3 confirmed murders and a further 8 plus. It is hard to pinpoint the murders of Keyes, as we would understand further in the video. Enough of me jumping around, and back to Keyes' earlier life. He was born to a Mormon family and was homeschooled. His family moved to a Latin Road area north of Colville, Washington, where they became neighbors and friends with the family of Chevy Kehoe, and occasionally attend a Christian Identity church. Eventually, however, Keyes rejected religion entirely, identifying as an atheist shortly before his arrest. The earliest crime to which Keyes admitted was violent sexual assault of a teenage girl in Oregon, sometime between 1996 and 1998. So what was particularly interesting to me was Keyes served in the U.S. Army from 1998 through 2000. He served at many bases, Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, and in Egypt. So this kind of builds up on something that I was closely looking at with this case, which later revealed in the video. So back to Keyes. He started a construction business in 2007 called Keyes Construction, which was located in Alaska. He worked as a handyman, contractor, and construction worker. Something that stood out to me was that he was self-employed, a carpenter, and an atheist. When I think of a carpenter, I usually think of the man of Galilee, building the stairway to heaven. Not Israel Keyes, building an escalator to hell, but I think that's enough about his early life. Before we can get into the Carpenter from Hell murders and his successful murder career, we must understand his methods. From everything that I've read about serial killers, and I'm not claiming to be an expert on the matter, but just a pure observer, he might be one of the most methodical and emotionless killers I have ever read about. And damn, he is terrifying. This is someone I would not like to be in the path of his gaze when he's on his rampage. The Demon Carpenter planned murders long ahead of time and took extraordinary action to avoid detection. Unlike most serial killers, he did not have a victim profile, meaning he didn't select just any simple victim like with any traits, probably hair color, eye color, how they look. Always killed far from home and never in the same area twice. On his murder trips, he kept his mobile phone turned off. And I have to say it again, turned off. He paid for items with cash. He had no connection to any of his victims. In the Courier murders, this was an Essex Junction, Vermont couple that would be discussed a bit later. He flew to Chicago and then rented a car to drive 1,000 additional miles to Vermont. He then used the murder kit that he had hidden 2 years earlier to perform the murders. 2 years. Again, he planned that kid 2 years. Damn. Keyes admired Ted Bundy and shared some similar traits with him. Both were heavy drinkers, methodical, and very intelligent.
And then there was the urge to take that little step, or big step, over to a physical event.
And it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happen overnight. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
And felt a possession over their victims. However, there are notable differences. Bundy murders were spread throughout the country, mainly because he lived in many different areas, and not as intentional effort to avoid detection as was the case with Mr. Keyes. Bundy only targeted attractive young women, usually with hair parted down the middle, while Keyes had no particular type of victim. So this brought me to thinking, where did all this discipline, self-control, and patience come from? Could it be from his time in the military? Now let's get to the part we all want to hear about. Keyes' first victims were in Washington State in the late 1990s. Within the Washington State, Keyes lived in multiple areas in the late 1990s to approximately 2008. Keyes admitted to investigators that he had killed 4 people in the state. These claims are the subject of an active investigation by the FBI as well as the police in that state. As a specialist in the U.S. Army, he was stationed in Fort Lewis sometime between 1998 to 2001. Keyes also lived in a small city of Colville in the eastern Washington and in the Maca Reservation community of Neha Bay on the Olympic Peninsula. Keyes did not have a felony criminal record in Washington, although he had been cited on Thurston County in or near Olympia for driving without a valid license. In an earlier incident, pleaded guilty to driving under the influence. Authorities are reviewing unsolved murders and missing person cases to determine which case, if any, may link Keyes to multiple murders. So the carpenter also confessed to at least one murder in the New York State area. Authorities have not determined the age, the identity or gender of the victim, or when and where the murder may have occurred, but regard to this confession as reliable. Keyes had ties to New York State as he owned 10 acres of property and a rundown cabin in the town of Constable. For the brief stint of his confession rampage, he also confessed to bank robberies in the state of New York and Texas. The FBI later confirmed that Keyes robbed the Community Bank branch in Tupper Lake, New York, in April 2009. The FBI stated that Keyes threatened people in the bank with a handgun, but there were no injuries reported. In his brief confession spree, he also admitted to authorities that he had burglarized a home in Texas and set it on fire. Keyes was linked to the deaths of Bill and Lorraine Currier of Essex, Vermont. Along with his confession, authorities say they have enough evidence to link Mr. Keyes to the murders of Bill and Lorraine. The couple was last seen after leaving work in June 2011. He broke into Bill and Lorraine's home on the night of June the 8th. Little did they know, their place of safety and security, a psychopathic man with an unquenchable thirst for blood, would break in. He tied them up, then drove to an abandoned farmhouse, where he shot Bill first before sexually assaulting and strangling Lorraine. Even with this confession, their bodies have not been found. 2 years prior to the Curier's death, Keyes hid a murder kit near their home, which included a handgun and various supplies. Keyes used these supplies during the murder of the Curiers. After the murders, he moved most of the items to the new hiding place in Parrishville, New York, where they remained until after his arrest. Keyes' last known murder was the kidnapping and murder of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, a barista working in Anchorage, Alaska. Authorities said that Keyes kidnapped her from her place of employment, stole her debit card and other stuff, then murdered her the following day. The cops stated Keyes sexually assaulted Samantha before murdering her. After Samantha's death, Keyes left on a cruise out of New Orleans, leaving Koenig's body in a shed. When he returned home, he took a photograph of her body with a 4-day-old issue of the Anchorage Daily News, maintaining the illusion that she was still alive, for the purpose to demand a ransom. After demanding a $30,000 ransom, Keyes dismembered Samantha's body and disposed of her in the Matnasukas Lake north of Anchorage. Here we look at the interrogation of him admitting to it and talking about the fish he caught.
How long does a body last in a freshwater lake? I mean, because there's no critters, they
Because
it depends on deep the temperature of the water.
And if the body's contained in something.
And it's not critters, it can be like,
bacteria,
Yeah.
organisms. So if the water is below, say, 45 degrees all the time,
I would think that would be good. I think you said up to 80 feet from the point you had told.
no, there's one that's a lot deeper than that.
But 200 feet. So we should like get a submarine.
Or deeper.
Deeper than 200 feet.
That's
the
the
lake.
deepest part, but
Oh.
I'm saying, I don't know how deep it was. I know the general area, and I had a fish finder, but it didn't register how deep it was. I just know.
This is truly disgusting. This had me thinking. A man so methodical, so clinical in the way he conducts business, just starts to use one of his victims' credit cards and demanding ransoms. This was out of the norm. Could it be that he just wanted to be caught? Tired of no one catching him, so he had to make it interesting and give the authorities some clues? Which brings me to this. Keyes, who may have been the most meticulous and methodical serial killer of modern times, committed suicide in his prison cell in Anchorage, Alaska. Since his death, details of his nefarious life that he relayed to the Anchorage police since his arrest on March 12, 2012 have become widely available. The current estimate for his death toll is 11 people, and his assaults span for at least 4 states, which is Arkansas, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. But there's probably more. His crimes spanned numerous states. He was very methodical in his planning, but towards the end, he appeared to have lost control, and the gap between murders narrowed. Like Bundy, Keyes knew that he was losing control over his desire to kill. In fact, Detective Monique Doyle of the Anchorage Police Department explained Israel Keyes did this because he got an immense amount of enjoyment out of it, much like an addict gets an immense amount of enjoyment out of drugs. This is not the first time serial killing has been compared to an addiction. Robert Capel, one of the main detectives responsible for catching Bundy, described Bundy's fascination with death and the need for necrophilia like a chemical tidal wave surging over him, like a craving for narcotic. This reported and demonstrated rise in killings and assault due to an out-of-control urge reminds us, like everyone else, their brain is constantly in flux and changing with life experiences. Conduct disorders, sometimes known as childhood psychopathy, is given as a diagnosis to children and teenagers who exhibit extreme antisocial traits, such as animal torture and cruelty. Dharma and Keyes have both been implicated in this. If the antisocial traits are still there after the age of 18, they would likely receive a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, or APD. In fact, conduct disorder, or CD, in childhood has been shown as a predictor of psychopathy in adulthood. To understand this idea of addiction, therefore, it is perhaps a good idea to consider the first time a child with CD comes across a cat, a dog, or a squirrel with that morbid sense of curiosity. Those with psychopathy and CD also show poor impulse control, which seriously increases the likelihood of any behavior that has been met with a high level of reinforcement in the past. If you toss in the awakening of sexual feelings and impulse brought on by puberty, those with CD will inevitably start to see humans in a different way. We must also look at the role of fantasy. Most people fantasize about things they cannot have, but a psychopath has every intention of getting everything that they desire. Psychopathic serial killers know that rape and killing provide exhilaration, and so in order to maximize that exhilaration, they will plan out and fantasize over their next act. As they gain experience and learn what type of things provide maximum levels of reinforcement, that they are likely to try and replicate these experiences, perhaps trying to make it better than that time before. It must not be underestimated how much time and planning goes into this process, as they are expecting a huge physiological payoff. If the anticipation and fantasizing goes as planned, the killer will get the stimulation they crave. But if not, all of that anticipation, planning, and personal investment will turn into frustration of rage. Eventually, the serial killer is likely to meet a number of personal problems that frustrate their efforts for stimulation. Firstly, if the stimulation is contingent upon ever complex rituals and acts, then they will become harder and harder to fulfill. Secondly, if well-planned and research avenues for killings are shut off due to police investigations or economic or social problems, then there's no promise of a forthcoming fix. And thirdly, there could be biological problems in the aging killer's brain that make it harder for them to control their impulses. So could this be the reason that Keyes went off track with his methodical killings? Because it was lacking the stimulation that he usually received? Did he hit his peak when he killed the couple in Vermont, and no other killing could give him the same feeling? Additionally, we know he admitted to robbing banks just to get a thrill. So by seeing this, we understand he was a thrill seeker. But what continues to baffle me is for a man that is labeled as a methodical serial killer with none of the weaknesses like Bundy and others, and I say this very reluctantly, a purist when it comes to the art of serial killing, had enough emotions and feelings to state that he would confess to the killings if his daughter did not find out about what he did. Following the arrest, he admitted to abducting Samantha Koenig from the coffee shop. He would later give police more details, though on the condition that they made one promise: keep everything out of the press. The reason? He did not want his young daughter to read about what he had done to Samantha. He stated, "I'll tell you everything you want to know. I'll give it blow by blow if you want. I have lots more stories to tell," he told the police. It soon dawned on the authorities that they weren't dealing with just a murderer. They were dealing with one of the coldest, most methodical serial killers of all time. So this was a case of Mr. Israel Keyes. And yes, a complete inhuman person. These cases and life experiences make me realize that we really don't know people. We only know what people portray to us. For example, the community that he was associated to and in, I bet, was just completely shocked when the news broke. Now that you've heard the case of Israel Keyes and some of my thoughts on this matter, what are some of your thoughts? What do you think about his mind, his situation, how he grew up? Could this have some part to play in what he has done in his lifetime? Well, thank you for your time, and see you on the next Inhuman Experience.